Hello, this is Shirley Wang, your host for All Around Classical, featuring performances and behind-the-scenes chats with world-class musicians. You're currently listening to the work of our featured guest for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, smash the like button for the episodes, and ring the bell for notifications so you won't miss the next upload for All Around Classical. Joining me today is Eugene Friesen, a four-time Grammy Award-winning cellist. Eugene is active internationally as a concert and recording artist, a composer, a conductor, and a teacher. His passion for improvised music has been featured in concerts all over the world with the Paul Winter Consort and with the Trio Globo. He appeared on Garrison Keillor's A Prairie Home Companion, playing with superstar soprano Renée Fleming. I first heard Eugene's playing during a live concert and was absolutely amazed by the emotional quality of his playing and stunned to find out it was all improvised on the spot in a beautifully classical style. He's also known as the Cello Man, teaching new cello techniques and improvisation in the United States, Asia, Europe, Egypt, and South America. His recording credits include 5 albums of original music, more than 30 CDs with the Paul Winter Consort, and hundreds of tracks featuring his rapturous cello playing on instrumental albums, films, and television scores. Eugene is an artist in residence at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, and on the faculty of the Buckley College of Music in Boston. This conversation with Eugene is personally inspiring to me. So let's hear what he has to say.
My name is Eugene Friesen, and I'm a cellist and a classically trained musician, but have also done a lot of composition and improvising, played in a lot of non-classical settings over the course of my career. And I love teaching, performing, almost every aspect of music, actually.
And Eugene, you're very, very modest because you have been a 4-time winner for the Grammy Awards, and you have published a very important book, Improvisation for Classical Musicians. And you teach at Berkeley. I can never say it right because in my mind I'm always saying Berkeley College, and in Boston. That's classical music.
You must be hungry.
I make fun of it. Berkeley College of Music. Right?
I like that. That's a good idea. I should start that.
Right. And so what a journey you've been through. I know I met you actually during a performance for Interfaith Conference where they wanted to bring a musical component that's really connected to the spiritual side, and I was just so impressed with your music. And at first I thought you were playing something that was an incredible composition. Then I realized you were making it up. I was like, whoa, how does he do that? And how did you make the transition? So I just want to know more about you and your journey.
Well, fantastic. So nice to talk to you, Shirley. Well, my father was a church musician, a choir director, and a church musician. I grew up in the Mennonite church. And so my parents were both born in Russia, emigrated to Canada, and then eventually to the United States, where I was born. But my orientation toward music as a kid was always as sacred music. You know, this is where I heard music in church and where we participated. It's actually where I learned to read music, was following along, singing hymns in the church. But then my father loved symphonic music and wanted me to play the cello. And I started doing that when I was a kid. But early, performance things were always centered around church. And that's really how I grew up. And then came the 60s, when I heard the Beatles for the first time, and especially heard how they used the cello, how George Martin, their producer, wrote these beautiful string arrangements that featured the cello in some of their songs. And I thought, wow, maybe the cello could actually be cool. And
could actually be cool, right? Just like music.
Well, there was such a divide between the music I played and some of the music I listened to. It just seemed like the music that I enjoyed listening to on the radio, was just a completely different world from the music that I was studying and the music that I was playing. And so that's when I first began to get interested in trying to make a connection between what I enjoyed moving my body to, and what I was actually playing. So that opened the door to a lot of different rhythmic ideas, and then I immersed myself in rock music for a time, and with everything that went along with it in California in the '70s,
Oh,
and I got very, very burnt out. I got very burnt out doing that. It just turned into more and more of a kind of a drug-related experience, and eventually I just decided to leave it all behind and just to devote myself to classical music again. So I did that for about 5 years, and then after that, um, met Paul Winter, a saxophone player who had his own group, the Paul Winter Consort, and as somebody who I had met when I was in college earlier, and he invited me to join his group, and that became really the context where I could start to put together these two parts of my personality: my love for classical music, and also my love for world rhythm and improvisation and creativity, channeled directly into my instrument.
I know one of the things you've been doing is to help classical musicians to explore improvisation, to explore different styles. And let's say for me, when I start to improvise, instead of feeling free, I feel afraid because I'm afraid of making mistakes. And it's so strange because there's no written music, but yet I think I'm going to make mistakes and I'm afraid. So how do you help somebody who is so used to working with what's written to something that's not, but yet it feels like we're going to make mistakes?
Well, I mean, you put your finger on a huge obstacle that we all have, not, and you've really outlined two different problems there, or two different issues. One is the issue of fear,
Mm-hmm.
and the other is the issue of making this transition from notated music, into really playing from your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And what I do is really nothing new in a way, because the whole tradition of improvising was very, very much alive up until about 200 years ago.
Right.
It was really just an absolute part of a musician's training,
Mm-hmm.
was improvising
Mm-hmm.
and entering into the elements of music in that kind of imaginative, free way. And so this is just reintroducing something very, very precious and something very, very important that has been missing for 200 years from our tradition. And I think that there was just kind of a tragic misunderstanding 200 years ago that that took this away from us in a way. And we could talk about this. We could do a whole series of podcasts about why this happened. It has something to do, I think, with the Industrial Revolution and with increased competition and kind of the uniform international standards of musicians that we're expected to, and the competitiveness for jobs. That we began to really focus on how to deliver a product as opposed to really immerse ourselves into a process.
Mm.
So I think that we, in a way, were victims of some of the change in mental paradigm that happened along with the Industrial Revolution. Actually, I think it's and thank goodness, in the last century, this started to be healed, and it began to be healed by jazz, basically by Black musicians who were bringing this very personal and creative attitude, back into music making. Where music making was really not about anything abstract or in history. It was really about who you were, who your family is, the circumstances you were in, and what are the sounds that really express that. And that is a tremendous gift that we have been given as a musical, entity.
Mm. Sometimes this makes me think about the the divide between the classical world and the non-classical world in the sense of um, once the concept of digital recordings was introduced, we are often taught, well, it's not about wrong notes, it's about how you express. But in reality, whether it's competitions, it's adjudications, or even performances, I don't think we ever walk into a live performance not expecting a classical performer to be perfect. It's now not really true that it's okay to make mistakes, because to be mistake-free has become the baseline of requirement. Then you make music on top of it. And I think, back in the days when CDs become this big thing, we started to expect, our ears got accustomed to mistake-free recordings. And the people going in sessions, they're making small chunks and they put it back together as a perfect performance. And then we go buy the concert ticket to the same artist into the concert hall. We expect the same delivery. And then as students, we grow up and just having this tremendous pressure of we cannot play or sing one note out of tune or slip our finger on anything, because that becomes a base requirement. Whereas when you go into jazz, we have the saying that there are no wrong notes, and becomes a totally different experience, both for the performers and also for the listeners. I'd like to talk a little bit about what you think about that.
Oh, huge topic, Shirley, and
Yes.
I'm really happy to talk about this. I've been doing a lot of thinking about it this year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and when we talk about, well, maybe it's easier just to illustrate from a story in my own experience. And when I was in November of 1986, so that was what, 40 some years ago or something, 30 some years ago. I recorded my first album, and the producer, Paul Winter, who is the band leader I've been working with for a long time, was producing this album, and he set us up in a beautiful cathedral in New York, St. John the Divine.
Yes.
It's the world's largest Gothic cathedral, and it has these just incredible acoustics in there.
Yes. Yeah.
And they have a fantastic Bechstein grant in their piano, beautiful piano.
Mm-hmm.
And we set up to record some piano and cello duos in the cathedral. And I had brought some compositions and some sketches in for us to play. And after a while, Paul said, why don't you guys just try doing some noodling for a while, just to loosen up a little bit? Noodling is what we call this kind of free-form musical conversation. And if it actually turns into something worth listening to, we dignify it with the term improvisation.
We dignify after noodling. Okay, got it. Take down notes, Professor.
Yeah, just noodle.
Right.
And after about an hour and a half of this kind of just free play, Paul came on the headphones and said, well, the album is done. And in fact, the album did turn out to be completely improvised in this free way. Each composition, each piece on the album had no discussion beforehand. Someone just played a note, and we followed each other, and they were just, it was like a gift. And especially amazing that it was actually recorded beautifully. So my first album, which is called New Friend, was an album that was recorded completely in this improvised way. And like I say, it was a total gift, because I had done plenty of improvising before then, but nothing that really had the kind of compositional integrity and shape and listenability that these improvs had. And so since then, I've thought a lot about how to get back into that special space, because it really is a kind of jazz musicians call it the zone. How do I get into the zone? Right. You might call it the Tao, is another way of thinking of it, right. The way from Buddhist tradition. And Jung might have called it the collective unconscious.
Right, right.
You know, as a way of really sinking into something very, very deep, you know, where you're kind of channeling this kind of universal truth or some kind of current from the underground, you know? And sometimes I think of it as breaking news, because it feels like when you're really tuned into that special source, that it is a way of really bringing the news of that source into the world in some mysterious way. So what is required to get into that zone? That has become really the question,
right.
You know, and over the years I've thought about it in kind of different ways, because, you know, you talked about digital recording and digital editing and the whole quality of like slicing things up. You know, and we do that in our musical training. We really cut things up into small little bits and pieces. We understand what every note is, what every mode is of every key, of every different, you know, kind of scale, about harmonies and compositions and orchestration and all the different parts of music that we love and that go into making this big thing. But of course, not one of them is actually what music is or where music comes from. We can cut it up into small pieces, but ultimately, you know, when you go to listen to music, you want the kind of wholeness that emerges from all those little tiny bits that we've cut up. So I think that there is, you know, an undeniable importance in studying those little bits and breaking things down. And you, as a trained musician yourself, you know the value of really focusing on specific details, as well as the importance of evaluating your performance when you're in there. But of course, when you go to perform, you cannot be evaluating your performance.
No, you can't.
That's absolutely not where music comes from.
No.
And what we're talking about is, go ahead.
No, go ahead. As a people sense it when you're evaluating yourself.
Exactly right.
Right.
Exactly right. And it's really just a little switch inside. You know, that you go from your practicing mindset, which can be very judgmental, you know, and perhaps it needs to be, but we practice so much of that evaluative mindset that when we go on stage, we're tempted to make music from that space too, and that's not where music comes from. So how do we practice going into that more mysterious and really spiritual realm, you know, which is the source of music? Right. And that is the question for us all to answer. And there are a lot of different gateways. You know, for me, my heritage in the church, in the Christian faith, has been important. But maybe even more important is my love of nature and being outside, and a special sense of connection that one can feel when you're in a very serene environment and just surrounded by natural beauty and wildlife. Yes. That is something that ignites my imagination and kind of opens my heart in a way. That is something that I love to place a space I love to place myself in, even when I come out on stage. And I can hear it in your performance. Did remind me of the feeling I get when I go out kayaking in a place that's untouched. As musicians, we really have two parts. We have the part that is the product when we perform. This used to be mostly the millennials who would share their music that's kind of raw and not fully produced on social media. And but then since the pandemic, all sorts of musicians and performers who are mature in their crafts have starting to embrace sharing their music on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, and they're not finished products like the way we used to see, you know, those mastered, digitized recordings that's produced in a concert hall or in a studio that is fully processed. And now we're actually going to see a lot more raw stuff that really sort of has fallen away, especially in the classical world. One thing, you know, back in the days, if you don't have management, if you don't have an agent,
you don't have the access to share your music with the world because they hold the tickets to introduce you for auditions, to introduce you to concert buyers. So then you can be showcased in a concert hall to be part of a concert series. Then you're advertised and marketed. Then people know to come to see you. But during this time, we don't really need that middleman anymore. We just put our music out there, our performances out there, people get to see, and they're raw. They're much more personable. And live streaming or homemade, what have you, and it's become accepted again. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that pendulum seems to be swinging in a very unexpected way on the process.
Beautifully said, Shirley. Oh, I love that. That's great. I think that this process is incredibly important. As musicians, a huge part of our motivation is to share our music because the whole point of it is to communicate something, to express something. Right. And so we're looking for venues to do that, even if they're unpaid venues. We're playing for our friends, for our families. We're putting it on social media, like you said, which is just fantastic. And to foster this practice of really going into that creative music-making space from a non-evaluative point of mind. Because as mentioned earlier, this is as an important a kind of ability or skill to practice as is actually playing the instrument, is how to control your mind, how to direct your mental and your spiritual energy into the music. And as musicians, we should be experts of this because ultimately it's really about listening.
Yes.
And listening, is always a test of whether you are really in the present moment or not. Mm-hmm. So we musicians should exemplify this above all else because listening is what we do.
Right. But I think a lot of musicians, because we feel there's so much pressure on putting it out there, that sometimes we disconnect from the source. To get to the point where you're comfortable sharing what feels like unfinished enough product on social media, required a lot of psychological undoing of the perfectionism. And I also think there has never been a time with this much sharing of music of different genre and to be heard by people. And it used to be so divided, but now I think it's a lot more cohesive. Things actually seem to speak to more people in just across the board. This is my personal thought, and I'm sure some people don't agree, and that's okay. I think the reason why we're always complaining we cannot get enough tickets sold for classical music concerts, unless it's a superstar, right, is because classical musicians have not been generous. Why would somebody pay minimum of $40 to $60 per person to get a nosebleed seat to come hear something they know nothing about, they have no exposure to, then they have no relationship with? And why don't they have that relationship with this genre of music? Is it because it's dying? I think a part of it is because we're not really sharing it. You see the pop musicians, you hear their music free all the time. Eventually, it comes back as commercial income. So it's not really free, but we get to hear. We go on Spotify, we go to YouTube, we turn on the radio, we do all those things for free. We hear their music, and then we go, wow, we really love it when they come to town and want to buy tickets to see them. But the classical musicians have not always been very generous in sharing their music. And I think all of those things are creating a change that we really have been needing for so long, but it's forced upon us. But that's my thought. I'm curious on maybe what your thoughts may be on something like this.
Well, I pretty much agree with everything you just said. And however, I think that there's another aspect, and I don't know how to diagnose the ills of supporting classical music in our culture. I mean, I guess that's the big question: is does that music really speak for our culture? And I think if it did, it probably wouldn't be in the situation that it is in economically, because these things have become major symphony orchestras and opera companies. So these are institutions that will never die, because what they do is represent some of the most highly crafted music in the history of humanity.
Right.
In terms when we think about orchestration and harmony and this kind of evolution of musical expression, in that is just incredible at a pinnacle. And I don't think there's any jazz musician or any musician from anywhere that would dispute that.
Right.
Yeah, no way. But it is also, undeniably kind of Eurocentric in its origins. And so, is that really who we are? That's another just question I would just kind of leave out there. And I think that when people hear an artist who has really put together a contemporary statement that is incredibly personal and that really uses the vocabulary of the present moment, in an innovative or original way, that it has a kind of light that shines through it that we're really, really drawn to, because we see ourselves in that light. And I see myself in light when I hear a Beethoven symphony,
right?
Or a string quartet, or a Verdi, Puccini. My God, it's like,
right?
Yeah, but I also come from that modality of training,
right.
Which has just been almost completely Eurocentric. So when I was really drawn to music of the Beatles, that was the entree that then made me look more into jazz and into blues and into more of the origins of where the Beatles music came from, which is really through a kind of what some people call Black Atlantic rhythm.
Right.
In other words, rhythm from Africa, from South America, distributed widely through the slave trade through South America and North America. This is music that just has a tremendous vitality in it and has a sense of community in it.
Right.
And has originality and cooperation and a lot of incredible positive values that I think are as complex sometimes rhythmically as Bach is harmonically.
Yes.
So there's just a quality of energy in there that feels so vital and so important that I think it's when we hear that, we feel like that is something that's speaking to us in a very direct way. Surely, and I can feel, the love in you for what you do.
I really do.
And I think that is, at the end of the day, that's what we have to offer. And ultimately, our love for everybody who's listening, too.
Right.
Because we are bathing in their light, just as they're bathing in our light. And it's a fantastic sharing. And, that feeling at the end of a piece, that kind of silence that comes, perhaps at the end of a quiet piece or something. There's a quality of something in that silence that is shared with an audience and a performer that I think just epitomizes what we do and why we do it. There's a kind of connection, a kind of unity in there that feels kind of like, almost like prayer to me, being gathered in that way, that connection. And, the world wisdom traditions teach us that there is actually no separation between us.
That's right.
What's really real in us is our hearts, is the love that we have, the light that we share with each other. And so in those moments, sometimes are the most tangible ways of really feeling that, ironically, in the silence. Not necessarily in the music, although the music may have calmed us enough so that we can really experience that kind of stillness and connection.
Wow, Eugene, it's been such a pleasure. I love today's conversation, and I hope it will bring some joy and some inspiration to others who are listening. So thank you so much. And until the next time, thank you so much.
My big pleasure. Thank you, Shirley.
To conclude today's episode, we will listen to Eugene playing Shadow Play.